A counter argument to our password manager advice, where to get cryptocurrency without KYC, and is privacy for everyone actually realistic? Welcome to the Q&A for episode 207, where we answer questions from our amazing patrons who keep us going and allow us to make this podcast for all of you for free. If you would like to join our Q&A, you can do so at patreon.com/surveillancepod or xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. Our first question actually was a direct message. You asked us not to use your name, so we're not going to. You said, this is some well-meant feedback about your recommendations regarding password managers in not last week's, but the last Q&A for 206. You said that for the average user, it's okay to write down a password and or memorize that for a long time. Since a password manager is something that holds the keys to everything else, I think that advice is not the best. Writing down a password is likely to encourage the user to reuse it and discourage rotation. While you're right that relative to most users, password managers greatly increase one's security posture, I think it should be very clear to those users how important it is to treat their security with caution. And then they say that using rotation also gives the user options over time to increase their KDF, like LastPass was not doing for people. They also said they would love to hear our opinion on using biometrics. My personal take on this, I don't think there's anything wrong with password rotation. If you want to do it, it's certainly not a bad idea. I don't think it is mandatory, though. A lot of people have actually stopped recommending it. And to be clear, what I'm about to say applies mostly to like corporate environments. I work a day job where they require us to rotate our passwords every 90 days. And a lot of my coworkers admit that they just add like a 1 to the end, or they just like have like a handful of passwords they just cycle through. So it doesn't actually increase security for the average user when it's forced on them. Now, again, that's for corporate environments. And a lot of the time, corporate environments are doing that kind of like as a safety net. Say somebody gets fired and for some reason they forget to like deactivate that person's account. Well, after 90 days, their account's not going to be active anymore anyway. So it is kind of like a fail safe, but it's a very corporate specific kind of thing. And again, it's not even recommended. So there's like pros and cons to it. I think for the average individual, I guess this kind of goes back to threat modeling. Why are you recommending that people rotate passwords? You mentioned like KDF, for example. Bitwarden actually had that solved. Not solved, but like when LastPass happened, because Bitwarden is open source, people were looking at it and they were doing their iterations. They were updating them, unlike LastPass was. But even so, a lot of people were calling for them like, hey, you should really switch to Argon too. Like, there's really no reason not to. And there was a whole back and forth and a discussion. And I think we might have even covered that at the time when it happened. If you're using a reputable password, and this is why a lot of the time we recommend source available stuff, even though that's not a silver bullet for everything, things like LastPass show that when the source is available, people who actually know what they're talking about, like people who know how to code, not like me, for example, they can look at the code and go like, hey, you're not doing as bad as LastPass, but you can do better. And Bitwarden responded in a very positive way and said, you're right, we're going to do better. And I want to reiterate, being open source is not a silver bullet. It worked for Bitwarden because they have so many expert eyes on them. But if you're using these password managers that are getting audits, that are source available, that like are getting those kind of eyes on them, I think that's less of a concern. Like 1Password, for example, I think that's a lot less of a concern. If you're saying people should rotate passwords just because, I don't know. Like, I would like to hear more of your opinion. And had I seen this message earlier, I might have thought to ask you that. I'm sorry. But I would like to hear more of your opinion of why you think people should be rotating passwords in the first place. And again, if it's like a Facebook situation where it's like, well, what if they're not iterating the passwords correctly? What if they're not encrypting them at all? Cough, cough, Facebook. Again, it's open source. We can see that they are doing what they say they're doing. So it really doesn't matter. The average person, I think, once they have a good password, if we didn't clarify this, I do apologize. We told people to have a password they can remember for their password manager. Once you're in the password manager, they should be randomly generating all their other passwords. That's the whole point of a password manager, is you don't need to remember passwords. You don't need to reuse them everywhere. Personally, I don't see the connection between how memorizing that 1Password would encourage them to reuse passwords when they should already be able to autofill with Bitwarden and stuff like that. I do appreciate your input, but yeah, I think if you want to rotate, I don't think that's a terrible option, but I wouldn't force people to do that or even encourage it really unless they had a reason. And then just to touch on it, opinion on biometrics. I like biometrics as long as it is followed up with like a good password or a PIN. So I actually do that on my phone. I have like a 6-word passphrase and then a YubiKey is 2FA, but once I'm logged in, it's thumbprint to unlock it. And I know I just lost like half of our listeners.
I guess regarding the first part, to kind of respond to that on my end, I actually don't think anyone is right or wrong on this. I think if anything, it's more just good criticism on our ends, because it is easy to say, oh, like just use better passwords, doesn't matter how you do it, write them down. But there is a very different way of writing down passwords that ranges in efficacy from really bad to really good. And there's probably a little bit of nuance we can get into when we talk about that. Because yeah, if you just write 5 passwords down and you just draw an arrow, oh, this top password's used for Facebook, Google, and Amazon, and then the second arrow is drawn to like 8 other services, then it's kind of ridiculous to write down your passwords and leave it on your desk. And then don't lock your front door and leave the window open next to your desk so everybody can see it from the first story of your apartment. My point is, yeah, you can do it very insecurely, and also you can do it very well. I know people like roll their dice and generate really cool things, but they just prefer to write it down on paper for whatever reason, be it it's more convenient for them or it's easier for them to understand. And then maybe they actually don't write down what accounts they're for. They have another system for knowing what that is. Maybe they do one for each service. So I think if anything, that's all I have to say about that. Like, just think about how you're implementing some of the advice. It's really hard for us, and we try to go into all of these examples when the discussion arises. We can talk about 10 plus minutes of how to make your password manager better, more secure, use it more safe. But when we're in this podcast, I think it's important to remember we don't have time to touch on all of those things. So we normally condense it in something like this podcast to, hey, use the password manager or write down your passwords. And it's kind of implied asterisk with proper security that fits what you're trying to do. And as for biometrics, I think the main advantage to biometrics, kind of like Nate was saying, they're just really resistant to things like shoulder surfing attacks. And also if you're concerned about cameras in public or people watching you type your password in any context. So I do think overall, like a strong passphrase in a lot of situations is going to beat biometrics in terms of like someone who just steals your computer and is trying to break into it. But you just understand the pros and cons. Next question is from Khalid. Hopefully I said that right. And they ask, do you know of any easy way to purchase cryptocurrency without KYC other than Bisq? I think we've answered this before, but just very quick response. If you're looking for a Bisq alternative, there's also Haveno, which is pretty much a Monero-ified version of Bisq. And if you're not going to look that route, I highly recommend the site KYC-Not-Me, KYC-Not-Me. It lists a ton of resources that rank the varying degrees of KYC and how to purchase, exchange, and do what you need with cryptocurrency. Just a bit of a teaser. It's not the easiest situation right now. My personal preference with a lot of this stuff is to try to get like KYC-free Bitcoin, because that's quite a bit easier to do, and then just convert that into Monero using a swap service. I find it to be a pretty good middle ground for myself, but that might not be okay for every threat model out there, which I fully understand. And in that case, you're gonna have to find some more creative ways of getting it.
And our last question from David Johnson. In reference to the well-known joke, I've heard several people reference this joke, so I think it's pretty well-known, but I'm going to repeat it because I haven't heard anybody actually tell the joke in a while, and there's the whole thing with XKCD and like, 10,000 people are learning something new every day. So the joke goes that 2 hikers are walking through the woods and they run into a bear, and one of them immediately sits down and starts swapping out his hiking boots for running shoes. And the other hiker is like, dude, what are you doing? You can't outrun a bear. And the first hiker goes, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you. You say, in reference to the well-known joke, in the current, and for the record, that was not my best delivery, in the current legal forest, how much of the gain of privacy, not security, do you think is attainable by outrunning the bear of surveillance capitalism versus only by outrunning the normie hikers? Again, we're paraphrasing here. In other words, what you're saying is if everyone did privacy and if everyone did all the things we recommend, like privacy focus, like switch to a privacy respecting browser, block a lot of ads and trackers with uBlock and DNS, VPNs or safing, like all those kind of things, wouldn't companies crack down and simply force more extreme measures? For example, they might require that you can only use an app to contact them, and that app has to have a lot of permissions. They might require you to use services that require ID verification, like ID.me, or alternately, they would just lay off a ton of people because they're not making as much money and everybody's going under. This is a really complicated question because I am not an economist or an expert. I'm going to lay a little bit of my political opinions on the line here. I think there's a little bit of truth to some of capitalism's ideas. I think there will always be people who see an opportunity and know how to capitalize on it. So in regards to like, wouldn't a lot of companies go out of business? Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to sound cold because those are people who like need money to feed their families, but I think there will be people who come along and see an opportunity for privacy-focused businesses or, something along those lines. I have mixed opinions on this argument, but like one argument I've heard was like the rise of automobiles. The rise of automobiles put out a lot of horse-related jobs out of business because nobody needed horse-drawn buggies anymore. Like, a lot of people who used to make and nail horseshoes, a lot of people who used to care for the horses and feed them. But it also created a lot of new jobs like, mechanics, and for a while there were like gas station attendants. And then same thing with the internet. Like, nobody could have predicted when the internet was created that we would have like eBay resellers and, influencers like myself and Henry. Like, I'm sorry for just calling us influencers. That felt gross. My point being is, like, in this hypothetical world where all of a sudden everyone started taking their privacy seriously, it would really detrimentally affect a lot of companies. But I think it's impossible to predict, and not to be like too techno optimistic about it, but I do think that is a good argument. We don't know what new opportunities would arise, both in terms of like people who recognize that market need that needs to be filled, and also, new jobs that didn't exist before. I hear you. And again, I don't want to get too political. I am a firm believer that our entire economic system needs to be overhauled. I don't think capitalism is the answer. I don't think communism is the answer. I don't think either one has really fared particularly well off paper. I don't know what that new economic system looks like, but I don't think either one is working now, and I certainly don't think it's going to work as we continue to go into the future. So the point I'm trying to make when I say that is, I don't think this fear, which I don't think you're necessarily arguing this, I think you're just kind of putting forth a thought experiment, but I don't think this fear of like, well, what does the future hold? Will these companies go out of business? Will people get put out of jobs? Will companies just get more aggressive? I don't think that should stop us for trying for a better future. I don't want to sound also like I'm that guy who's like kicking the can down the road. Like, well, that's not my problem. That's future me's problem. But at the same time, like, I think we are quickly speeding towards a world where we're going to have to pick a new economic system one way or another. And again, I don't know what that's going to look like. I don't claim to have the answers, but what we're doing is not going to work regardless. So I don't think that should stop us from trying to make a better world. We're going to have to do something's got to give one way or another. So we may as well try to make it better along the way. That's the best I can offer. Somebody probably does have a good answer. I haven't found it personally.
I don't know if I disagree with Nate. I feel like I read this question very differently, because I actually do in some ways agree with this, right? I mean, with the way apps are set up right now, the way most people use the apps doesn't cause any issues for the company. Let's just use YouTube. YouTube's a great example, because this also applies to some other things I'll touch on in a second. Google's whole entire revenue model for YouTube is to be able to accurately understand what people want to see and tailor ads to those people. And that way ad publishers make money when they run ads on YouTube, and then everybody's somewhat happy, with lots of issues along the way. What happens when something like YouTube, though, let's say, half the people use YouTube are no longer using it in a way that actually serves the advertisers. That's going to cut into YouTube's profits, and YouTube is going to have to crack down. And that's what we have been seeing on YouTube. We've been seeing more KYCing globally. We've been seeing them try to prevent people from doing this exact thing with ad blockers, which is what I was referring to earlier. The more people who block ads, the more these companies are going to crack down and prevent you from engaging with the content with ad blockers. So I think there is, and I said this before, privacy is a big privilege right now. A lot of people in our communities are aware of an issue lots of other people don't even think about. And if you have already taken steps to improve your privacy, you're much better off than other people. So in some ways, we are kind of profiting, not financially, but we are kind of getting to piggyback off of other people who don't really do anything with their privacy.
Kind of like credit card rewards.
Kind of like credit card rewards. Yeah, it's a good way to put it as well. So I think it's something for us to think about. I think realistically, if you're somebody who is involved with privacy and you're passionate about it, the way that the world responds to you caring about privacy is out of your control. And I don't think that we should change our behavior because, we might be perhaps making it worse for other people's privacy, because if we reclaim privacy, then these companies are going to be more desperate for funds, and maybe they'll make privacy worse for everybody. That's out of our control. All we can do is, hope that us valuing privacy encourages other people to care about privacy. And in the long run, I don't know what it leads to, but it leads to some kind of system where companies are forced to respect privacy, and they might actually have a financial incentive to do so. That's how I interpreted the question. I don't know if that's related to much of what you were saying. So this is a private XMR chat. I don't think you guys can see these private chats, so it's just for us. But pretty much someone just said they love listening to the show, and they sent us a little Monero tip. So if you ever want to leave a question, you don't have to be on Patreon to leave these questions. You can go ahead and do them through XMR chat. That's one time, and it's through Monero. We don't know anything about these people, and you could put any username you want in. I don't even think it requires an email. You just put in the amount and you just send off your Monero and you just put whatever name you want. So it's pretty cool.
That's been going pretty well so far. So thank you guys who have contributed, whether you've asked a question or not. We really appreciate you. Yeah, short week on the questions. So we had a counter argument to our password manager advice, which, we love hearing from you guys. I think I can safely speak for Henry here. We don't think that we're perfect. I have been corrected on many, many things. Even if we may not always agree with your perspective on something, we really enjoy hearing from it. Sometimes you guys make really good points. We are not always perfect, and we are not afraid to admit when we got it wrong. So thank you guys for keeping us honest. We had a question about where to get cryptocurrency without KYC and whether or not privacy for everyone is really a sustainable goal. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for asking questions. And again, we appreciate those questions and we appreciate your support for the podcast. If you are not already on Patreon, you can join the Q&A at patreon.com/surveillancepod. For $5 a month, you also get to join our Signal chat, which has been pretty active lately. And as Henry just mentioned, we also have xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. You can leave a one-time donation and you can ask a question, or you can just, I don't even think you have to leave a message. I think some people just leave a donation. But yeah, we really appreciate you guys. Thank you for everything. And we will be back with 208 this coming weekend.